I am very worried about what Netanyahu is doing and some of his allies in government and what may happen to the Palestinian people. And let me tell you something. I mean, I haven't said this publicly, but I think the United States gives billions of dollars in aid to Israel. And I think we've got to put some strings attached to that and say you cannot run a racist government. You cannot turn your back on the two-state solution. You cannot demean the Palestinian people there. You just can't do it and then come to America and ask for money.
Long time no see. I was on a delegation in Israel at the invitation of its previous government. And if you are willing to hear me out, you may be surprised as to what I did there, what I learned, and as to my conclusions on whether Israel's ongoing desegregation and anti-discrimination program will work. Welcome into TYT's Overruled. I am your host, Adrienne Lawrence. Why I was in Israel. As many of you know, in addition to commentating for TYT, I specialize in making workplaces inclusive. Basically, I help organizations successfully desegregate their workforce and reduce discrimination so people from different backgrounds can work together. I'm a court-appointed expert in this regard. I also speak at colleges, work with NASA, and so on. That's why Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs invited me to participate in its first ever social impact delegation, where I joined a group of experts and intellectuals in candid conversations with left-wing leaders in Israel's public and private sectors. From pro-Palestinian journalists to former cabinet members, we met with a number of individuals, many brown and black, who are fighting there for equality. And for days, we talked about the inequities Palestinians living in Israel and other marginalized people are facing there, and also what's being done to try to ameliorate the harm. So here's the gist of what's going on to desegregate Israel, how it works, and whether I think it'll actually work. A quick sidebar. 3 things before we start. 1, I am opposed to Israel's new right-wing leadership, and I can't say that I met anyone in my time there who voiced support for it. The previous administration invited me, and this delegation was supposed to happen last year. 2, Israel's existence is not and should not be in question. Let's get that out of the way. It's a country, it's not going anywhere, and there are progressive minds there fighting for change, and they need support. And 3, like a number of people on the ground there, I too support the well-being of Palestinians, both outside of Israel's borders and within. And when I say borders, I mean the region international law recognizes as being Israel. So not the West Bank or Gaza. All right, let's go ahead and get this started. What's the backdrop? Israel is segregated and racial discrimination there is real, not much unlike many areas in the U.S. Arab and Jewish communities largely live, work, educate separately, with Arabs relegated to areas that are very much less desirable and very much neglected. People were somewhat open about this. And yes, there are many mixed cities, but even in those cities, there's still considerable segregation. The progressive minds I spoke to spoke of maternity wards where Muslim and Jewish women would not give birth next to each other, where there were preschools and dental offices that wouldn't hire Arabs or Ethiopian Jews for fear of what their customers might think. The segregation is real and it's also deeply rooted. This per the Council of Foreign Relations. This continuing separation is due to factors including the legacy of restrictions imposed at the time of Israel's founding, which outline where non-Jewish Israelis can live, separated schools, and labor laws that discriminated against Arabs, as well as prevailing prejudices against Arab citizens residing in Jewish neighborhoods. Bear in mind that Arabs are nearly 22% of Israel's population, and the vast majority of them are of Palestinian descent. And these folks are basically living in an unofficial Jim Crow. What's going on? In 2016, Israel's government outlined a 5-year plan to invest $3.3 billion in desegregation and anti-discrimination. Now, this plan focused on uplifting Arab communities in particular, uplifting them in employment, education, transportation, community safety, and so on. And Israel's previous administration renewed that plan and tripled its budget in 2021. As the Council on Foreign Relations explained in the fall of last year, in 2021, the government approved a 5-year plan to boost employment, improve healthcare services and housing, and develop infrastructure, among other goals for the so-called Arab sector. The plan, set to cost over $9 billion, follows a similar initiative by the previous Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who designated more funding for the sector than any of his predecessors, even as he frequently incited anger toward the Arab community. Now, I had the honor of meeting many of those who are implementing that plan, And while the individuals seem to be very passionate about what they do and their efforts clearly seem to be coming from a humanitarian place, I can pretty much tell you that those controlling the government are largely motivated by economics. And they should be. Basically, Israel cannot sustain itself unless there's greater workforce participation from those who have been excluded. Israel is wisely implementing what we call the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is DEI. What's the business case for DEI? The business case for DEI basically recognizes the financial benefits that come from integration and inclusion. Experts have long known that segregation, discrimination is extremely expensive. Rather, if you include people, you're in a better position to thrive. Just look at the US. If racial and ethnic bias weren't such a thing here, we'd collectively be $51 trillion richer as a nation. The hit ends up hitting our GDP. That comes from gaps in employment, education, and earnings across all races. The reality is that some folks would prefer to hold on to their biases and feel better than you than be the legends at the bank. Why does Israel need to implement the business case for DEI? After decades of segregation and discrimination, Israel has not been thriving. Yes, it's booming in tech right now and has some strong social services like universal health care, but the cost of living is high, wages are low, and the population is steadily growing. And full workforce participation is lower than it needs to be, which means GDP, taxes, and the like are also far lower than they need to be. Check this. Palestinians living in Israel, other Arabs, and Ethiopian Jews, they make up about 25% of Israel's population in toto. Yeah, so about a quarter of Israeli citizens aren't white Jews, believe it or not. But if that 25% is boxed out of education and good jobs due to discrimination, they're also boxed out of fully contributing to Israel's economy. But Israel still has to take care of them using tax dollars. And I am no economist, but I can tell you that's not sustainable, making less than you spend. And another sidebar. You may be wondering why Israel's economy is crippled by its Jim Crow in ways the U.S. wasn't. Well, there are three reasons I can kind of think come to mind. Well, one, percentages. Israel's brown and black population, near 25%. During the 80-year span of Jim Crow in the U.S., black Americans averaged about 10% of the population. 25% versus 10%, huge difference. Two, size and stream of income. Israel's the size of New Jersey and it's pretty much riding solo. Whereas the United States is huge and it had 48 contributing streams of income during Jim Crow? So yeah. And third, segregation uniquely cripples Israel because of also what's going on with the ultra-Orthodox community. Ultra-Orthodox Jews make up around 15% of Israel's population and they are growing with an average of 6 children per family. But a large number of the men don't work, opting to study religious texts in exchange for government stipends. And the job market for ultra-Orthodox women is very limited, not only due to gender, but pregnancies, practices, discrimination, lack of access, and so on. So altogether, Israel's population is growing. It needs tax dollars to support its people, but some 40% of its workforce is under-participating. And 25% of that is largely due to discrimination. So that's why Israel has been investing in integration and inclusion over the last few years. What do Israel's integration and inclusion efforts look like? Israel's integration and inclusion efforts appear to be holistic, as in it's a lot more than just giving people jobs and going away. From educating people about their anti-Black, anti-Arab biases to pouring funds into training Arab women in education fields and also professions where they were generally underrepresented. Also to upping the budget of agencies so that they can prosecute discriminatory employers. Funding an anti-racism unit that holds state workers accountable. Also trying to encourage schools to teach education in different languages. Progressives there seem to be putting in the work, but I really don't know that it'll be enough. Will Israel's integration and inclusion efforts work? Unfortunately, it seems to me that it's unlikely that Israel will be successful in integrating and including Black and brown people living within its borders for one reason in particular: time. The progressives in Israel simply don't have enough of it given how long desegregation can take, as that is up against its new right-wing government that is focused on exclusion. Even if Israel poured more resources into it and everyone in government agreed racism is a problem, successfully integrating Israel would take decades. The country has been in existence for some 75 years, and as explained, segregation between Jews and non-Jews was a part of its foundation. When people have been living separately for generations, most times they've developed biases, beliefs, and outlooks that can make it difficult for them to coexist harmoniously. And outside of the government workforce, Israel can only do so much in terms of forcing integration, as it would trample the rights of private companies. Also, language barriers between Arabs and Jews are significant, which makes immediately desegregating workforces and schools a challenge. The last school to desegregate in the United States was in 2016. Yes, 2016. 62 years after the Supreme Court issued Brown v. Board of Education. And although Israel is a much smaller country than the U.S. and segregation is still so much of an issue here, I really fear that Israel doesn't have 62 years or even half that to do better than we did. As it concerns integration and inclusion of Arabs and other marginalized groups there in Israel, time is truly of the essence because of Israel's new right-wing government. Specifically, Itamar Ben-Gvir at the helm of national security terrifies me and many others. If you're unfamiliar, Ben-Gvir leads Israel's Jewish Power movement. That's a far-right party that fears what will happen when the country has a non-Jewish majority in the coming years. And instead of helping people to live together harmoniously and backing inclusion, Ben-Gvir is rallying people against Arabs and non-whites there, with the goal of removing them, all under the guise of disloyalty. Now, this push to expel Arabs and others is the right's answer to fixing the economic workforce issues I mentioned earlier. And again, Arabs alone are more than 20% of Israel's population, and the vast majority are of Palestinian descent. With Ben-Gvir dictating policy, atrocities that we see go on in the West Bank aren't a stretch for what could happen within Israel to a greater extent. A reported 1/3 of Israel's military voted for Ben-Gvir in the last election, knowing full well that his messaging effectively advocates for violence against Arabs, Ethiopian Jews, queer people, and so on. The man is consciously stoking hatred and animosity between Israel's Jews and Arabs, laying the groundwork for a civil war. As the New Yorker recently explained, Ben-Gvir's predecessor from the Labor Party had worked to limit gun access. Ben-Gvir now said that he would expedite gun licenses for Israeli citizens. This is really straight out of a Tucker Carlson-type playbook. And do you remember the near $10 billion government-funded, renewed 5-year integration and inclusion program that was specifically directed at Arab communities? Well, Ben-Gvir's party suggested that it would work to scrap the program, stating without evidence that a vast sum of the money had gone toward funding terrorism and crime. But Ben-Gvir offered little in the way of policy. The entire agenda here seems to be to stop progressives from desegregating Israel and to advance discrimination to the point of justifying exclusion of brown and black people, instead of integration annihilation. In closing, I will say this. Although Israel got a late start in the game, it is evident that the country has started doing some of the work to integrate for the betterment of its society. Now, the progressives in Israel very much seem to want integration. They want to thrive in peace, and they're putting in the work on the ground to do that. But the left is dwindling. And now that right-wing extremists are in the driver's seat controlling the country's future, as Senator Sanders said, something must be done to ensure Israel continues along its path of desegregation and also addressing discrimination. Because instead of bolstering inclusion efforts with the goal of hopefully living harmoniously and thriving, members of Israel's new government would rather really stoke hate so that they can exile and possibly annihilate entire groups of people. That is, Palestinians living within Israel, Ethiopian Jews, and other marginalized voices. I don't think that that is okay. Nor do I believe that it's okay to turn our backs on progressives there in Israel who are pushing for real change. We cannot just focus on resolving segregation and discrimination that goes on in the West Bank, Gaza, or at Israel's borders. We also need to uplift such efforts going on within Israel's borders. Thanks for watching.